All right, so here we are at the top of the hour. We're going to get started. My name is Matt Shell, aka Matt Mirrorfish, and I am going to be showing you image effects today. We're just going to kind of skim the surface and look at a couple of effects that I think are, a high return for a little bit of effort just to kind of make your games look a little bit better without doing a lot of work. And those effects are screen space ambient occlusion, global fog, bloom, and vignetting and chromatic aberration. So we've got here a new asset. This is the corridor demo created by our excellent artists. And so we're going to be taking a look at this. This is already set up with some image effects on it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what image effects are, and then we're going to turn off some of the image effects that we have and put them back on and replace them and go through all the settings and talk about what they do. So if you haven't grabbed this yet, this is an asset which is on the asset store for free from the publisher Unity Technologies. It's called Corridor Lighting Demo. And you can go ahead and grab that. When you first open it up, you're going to need to give it a few minutes to bake the global illumination, the lighting, and the reflection probes. So you may open it up and it looks a little weird. You'll see some progress bars down on the bottom cooking, and then it'll look like what you're seeing here on my screen. So don't worry about that if that's what's going on for you. But, I think there's not a heck of a lot to follow along with here, so feel free to just sit back, watch me go through, and then play with this afterwards. I think that would be fine. We're not going to be doing a lot of scripting today or really creating any scenes. We're going to work with this pre-existing scene, which, as I said, you can grab from the asset store. So what we've got here, so I've just opened up the scene corridor demo, which is in the scenes folder. That's what we're looking at. And in the hierarchy, you'll see there is a holder object called cameras, and within it, there's a camera called main camera. This camera has a number of scripts on it which are processing the image coming from this camera. So let's just talk for a second generally about what image effects are. So basically what's happening is Unity is rendering our scene at whatever frame rate we're currently running at. And so what it's doing is rendering, let's say, 30 or 60 frames, still images, per second. And as each of those, as the geometry and the content in the scene is rendered, what we're doing with the image effect is we're applying an additional post-processing pass to each of those frames as they're rendered. So it's worth noting that these are going to come at a performance cost, right? You're going to get a lower frame rate the more image effects you add and the more heavily you process your images. So you can think of it if you've ever used an image editing application like Photoshop or GIMP or even Instagram. These are post-process effects where we take our frame and we apply some manipulation to the content, usually to the pixel content. And so here we have our scene, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start by turning off all the image effects on here. Now, there are a couple image effects on this camera that we are not going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about the vignette and chromatic aberration. We're going to talk about the screen space ambient occlusion, the global fog, and the bloom. We're not going to talk about anti-aliasing, depth of field, or tone mapping. I'm going to leave those for another session where we're going to talk generally about camera emulation and creating camera-like effects, usually referring to film camera, right? Movie camera style effects, which is kind of what the depth of field and tone mapping fall under. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work from the top here and just turn everything off, and we can see kind of the raw image, and then we will start adding some processing of our own. So let's just start by turning off the vignette, the SSAO, the anti-aliasing, the global fog, the depth of field, and the tone mapping, and then the bloom. And so you can see quite a different image here. It's a little bit sort of sharper and harder. So some of what we're doing is adding a little bit of softness, especially with the bloom, depth of field, and fog. And so actually before I go any further, let me just show you this scene in movement with the image effects on. That'll probably give us a better idea as opposed to looking at a still image. So let's just play this real quick, and let me actually maximize so we can see a little bigger. And my computer is chugging a little bit today, running low on CPU between the stream and the scene and everything. Let's actually just maximize so we can see it nice and big. There we go. So we've got our scene, we've got some little sort of fog and steam effects, we've got our different spheres. The green one in the back is showing an emissive material. We can see the bouncing sphere is moving in and out of the directional light, which is coming through the skylight. This circle here, and then we've got our reflective red material here, and our camera just kind of pans around and just to give us some different views on the scene. So let me just pause now, turn off the image effects so we can see this in motion without them. So let's just switch off all of this stuff and we can get a look at what's going on. There we go. And actually, let's just pull up the stats here so we can see this is currently running at about 40 frames per second, which is nice actually considering how much my machine is struggling right now. And if we turn the image effects back on, we'll see that there's going to be, you know, a pretty notable cost in performance. Now, you know, all of these have been written to be as performant as possible, but because we're applying each of these effects to each frame that's processed, there definitely is a performance cost. So throw it back on. You see, you know, quite a dip there. In this case, we lost about 20 frames per second of performance. Now that, you know, this is probably not the best benchmark. I was testing this on another machine and was getting, you know, 60 frames. So this Mac that I'm running on right here is kind of struggling a little bit with the stream and the scene. But as you can see, right, a pretty significant, you know, performance balancing act that we're going to want to do there when working with image effects, right? And this is true with anything that you're doing in your game. You're going to want to keep in mind the trade-offs between performance and, you know, pretty pictures or whatever it may be. So what we're going to do, I'm going to leave this camera as is, and I'm going to duplicate it, and we're going to mess with the duplicate. So I'm going to highlight the main camera in the hierarchy here. We're going to choose Edit, Duplicate, and we're going to deactivate this main camera. So I'm just going to go to the inspector, hit the checkbox here to turn it off. We don't want to have two cameras running at the same time. We'll get an error message about audio listeners. There should only be one. And then let's call this Cam 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn off all our image effects. So we're going to turn off the vignette, SSAO, anti-aliasing, global fog, depth of field, tone mapping, and bloom. And we're actually going to remove the bloom, remove the global fog, remove the SSAO, and remove the vignetting. And then we're going to add those back in. We'll leave the other ones that we're not going to talk about. We're going to build this back up. All right, so the first thing that we're going to add is the screen space ambient occlusion. So now I've already got, so each of these image effects is just a C# script, right? It's a script that we add to our camera. In this case, they've been added to the project already. They're here in this image effects folder. So we have a folder for the scripts, the shaders, and the textures. And so here in this script are all the scripts that we need, right? Now, if you are working in a new project and you don't have these imported yet, you can go to Assets, Import Package, Effects, and import them that way. These should have been downloaded when you downloaded Unity 5 if you chose to download the the standard assets content that you can choose to download in the installer. I think it's the default. If for some reason they are missing from this menu or you chose not to download them, you can get them from the asset store. And that's just going to be under standard assets from the publisher Unity Technologies. And actually, you may want to just grab them from there because we are updating them periodically. And so that will probably be the most current version of those scripts. So what we're going to do is we're going to add, let's start by adding our SSAO. So we're going to go to Script, Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, and drop it on here. We're going to go to Add Component and drop it on. You can also access this by going to Component, Image Effects, Rendering, SSAO. Now notice there are two types. There's ambient obscurance and ambient occlusion. These are just different algorithms. They give kind of a different look. As with all image effects, this is as much an art as it is a science. So you're going to want to just choose something that gives you a result that you like, that works for your content. I've even seen people using these in combination. If you look at the Viking Village scene cameras, you'll see there's an example of using both of them. I'm going to use ambient occlusion for this one. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move it up on the game object here. So I'm going to click on this little gear icon, choose Move Up, and again, and again, and I'm going to move it above all of my other image effects. Now, this is something that not everybody knows. The order that scripts are on a game object is linear, right? So this script is going to be run first, then this one, then this one. And with something like image effects, that means that this is going to process the frame, and then the output from this, or the current frame buffer, is going to be processed by the next effect and the next, and so on. So it actually really matters the order that you put them in. Now, there isn't a hard and fast rule for the order that you want to put these in. I've seen people doing many different things, but in this case, I'm going to put my SSAO first, which I think is generally a pretty good practice. Now, what is SSAO? What it's doing is it's adding some artificial contrast to our image. So if we bypass it, we can see, especially if we look at these corners and crevices, that there are some sort of artificial shadows being added. And so what this is doing is it's actually just overlaying some noise over the kind of cracks and crevices in the geometry and adding some darkness there. So we can make this very visible if we take the occlusion intensity parameter here, which is currently set to 1.5, and just turn it all the way up. And we can see, especially up here, right, we can see it gets kind of dirty looking. And you can use it to emulate these kind of effects, right? It's not only necessary to use it for shadows, as you'll see in a minute, we can get some pretty weird stuff out of it as well. But in this case, so when you're tweaking these effects, especially for something like this that's a little bit subtle, it can be a good idea to kind of crank it right up so you can really see what's happening and then dial it back in. So let's take this blur here, which is how many times is this image being blurred to smooth out the darkness that we're adding? And I'm going to turn it right down, and you'll be able to see that our scene is covered in ants. The space station here has been infested. And so this is actually the raw image output that's being added before the blur pass, right? This crazy pattern of speckles. But when we blur it and smooth it, right, here's one blur pass. So basically it's as if we're in Photoshop or another image editor and we just applied the blur filter once. Now we applied it twice, right? Including by setting the blur to 2. Now we're doing 2 blur passes, meaning we blurred and then we blurred that output again, and we could go to 3 or 4. Once we get to 4, it starts to look a little crazy, so I'm not going to go that far. But around 2 I thought looked pretty nice. And keep in mind, right, these blur passes are definitely going to be a little bit computationally intense, right? So you're gonna have a little performance cost as you increase them. The downsampling, let's take it off for a second. 0. Let's take it off for a second. The downsampling, you can see, if we turn it all the way down, we can see these are actually quite small pixels. And as we push it up, it's actually basically upscaling it, making the dots bigger, but also kind of blurrier. So this is Here we were on 2, I think. This is really just one of those things where you can kind of season to taste and find something that works for your scene. I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule to this. I'm going to keep it around there. And then the occlusion attenuation, if we turn this down, we can see it allows us to reduce the noise pass that's being laid over. So we can kind of use this to dial in our occlusion and then sort of fine tune it. So let's set it somewhere around there. First of all, let's turn our occlusion intensity back. Let's turn our blur pass back up. Let's go to 2 and turn our occlusion intensity right down. And we can use a little occlusion attenuation. And let's try turn that off and on. That's probably still a little intense, right? Let's dial it down there. That looks reasonably natural, right? Especially up in this corner. I think that's looking pretty good. Now, again, right, this really depends on the mood that you're trying to create, the content of your scene, what lighting you already have, and so on, right? So it's really as much a creative choice as anything else. The last parameter that we have here is the min Z or Z value. And what this is this is the minimum distance, Z distance, so the depth distance going away from the camera that this will be rendered at. So if we turn this up, we can see that it goes away, and that is to prevent players from sticking their face in the corner and ruining the illusion, right? Because this is totally fake. It's not based on any real lighting. You can think of it almost as just like a kind of a contrast pass that we're putting over the image using this sort of noise algorithm. So that is SSAO, Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. I'm not going to talk about ambient obscurance because it's fairly similar, and I'll leave that to you guys to discover. And so we are going to continue, and we're going to talk about global fog. So the next thing that I'm going to add is going to be a global fog image effect. So I've got my camera still highlighted here in the hierarchy. Let's do it this way this time. We're going to go to Component, Image Effects, Rendering, and choose Global Fog. And then we can see our image changes, right? Let's move this up. We're going to put this after our SSAO. And so if we turn it off, we can kind of see what it's doing there. It's adding this fog and this haze. Now, one thing that global fog does that our regular fog that you may have worked with in the free version of Unity, global fog allows us to set a height for the fog, so we can have the fog kind of pool up around a certain height above the ground. And that's done here using the height fog checkbox. So let's just switch a few things off first. Let's turn off the distance fog. We can see that most of the fog goes away. If we turn off the height fog, we can see we lose that fog that's around the floor. And so we can set the height of the height fog. We can raise it up. I'm going to leave it pretty low on the ground here, just a little haze on the ground. And we can set the height density, right? So the height density, we could have it be like kind of a spooky graveyard, right? Or just really a little bit, which is, I think, all we really want here. The start distance controls how far away from the camera we have to be before the fog starts rendering. In this case, it's set to 0, so it's basically starting right away, but it doesn't build up until we get a little further away, which is based on the density. Now, it's important to note that some of the settings for the global fog are taken from the fog that is in the lighting panel. Now, if you use Unity 4, you may be used to finding the fog settings in the scene settings, but in Unity 5, they're now part of the lighting menu. So to access that, we're going to go to Window, Lighting, and I've actually opened my lighting and docked it here next to the inspector. And you'll see down at the bottom, we have the fog here. Now notice I've actually got this turned off, yet some of the parameters are still affecting the global fog. Now, if we turn this back on, it has no effect. And that is because the regular fog, the non-global fog, does not work in the current rendering path that we're using. And right, and this is something that you may run into. If we look in our player settings, if we go to Edit, Project Settings, Player, and we go down to here where it says Other Settings, I already had it open, you'll see that this project, the rendering path is set to deferred and the color space is set to linear, which are not the defaults, but generally will produce a slightly more high fidelity result. So you may want to play around with those, but one sort of catch in this case is that regular fog does not work if we're in the deferred rendering path. So just something to be aware of there, and one of the reasons why we're using global fog in this scene. So going back to the lighting tab, so here we can set the fog color, right? We can change it if we want. We could make it a lovely dark blue or a strange bright blue or more white. Now notice as we go to white, we're getting this kind of, the scene is getting more green, and that's because we've got this, this green emissive light here, and the scene generally has a little bit of a greenish tint. So the reason, if I undo, we'll go back to our sort of purplish grayish color, or bluish gray. The reason that we're using this color is because it kind of contrasts with the kind of greenish tint that we have in the scene. I asked the artist who made this scene, you know, why he chose that color, and he said because it's sort of the opposite on the color wheel of these greens and stuff that we're using. So again, right, this is a creative aesthetic choice that we're making here. Now, if you're looking to make outdoor scenes, especially with some distance in them, a little bit of bluish fog, which will kind of simulate the light reflecting off the ozone, can look nice. I've had some good results with that. Or you can set your fog to one of the colors in your skybox. I generally recommend, especially if you're trying to match the procedural skybox that comes with Unity, set it to one of the colors closer to the horizon, and they should kind of blend pretty nicely. But, you know, play around with it and find something, again, that works with your scene. I've also done some stuff with black fog to kind of give a really dark kind of feel, like a nighttime kind of feel, or heavy blue fog to make an underwater kind of vibe. You know, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with fog, and it can make things look nice. In this case, we're just using, you know, a fairly subtle amount here, just kind of building up in the distance, but it's kind of softening the scene and giving it a little bit of atmosphere. The fog modes here control how the fog falls off as it gets farther away. So in this case, we're using the exponential squared curve. We could also use exponential, which falls off, as you can see, much more slowly, right? So we've got fog right up here in the foreground. Or linear. Now, linear is interesting because it allows us to set a start and an end time. So right now we have the start is at 0. As I push it back, we'll be able to see, let's actually turn... Let's bring the end in close. There we go. And as I adjust this start, we can see, so we could have something really weird, right? Where the fog is just like all sort of in this tight little line there. Not naturalistic, right? But maybe you could find something cool to do with that. But generally speaking, I tend to like these exponential or exponential squared curves. This is sort of gentle and nice for a more realistic kind of feel. Obviously, for something more stylized, you can find whatever works. Okay. So, and that's basically what we've got for the fog, right? If we turn it off, there's our scene, turn it back on, and we're just adding that nice little bit of kind of bluish purplish haze, especially, you know, around the floor and in the distance. The next effect that we're going to talk about is one of my favorites, and it's bloom. And so let's grab our camera, make sure it's selected. We'll go to Component, Image Effects, Bloom and Glow, and choose Bloom. Now there's two other versions here. Bloom and Flares is an old version, which you should no longer use unless you have old legacy projects that depend on it. Bloom Optimize is going to be a bit more performant, especially for things like mobile devices. You may want to play around with that if you're getting too much of a performance hit from the regular bloom. But we're going to look at the regular bloom in this session. So let's add it to the camera. Shiny. We can see it's adding this nice sort of additional layer of softness and haze to our image. Now let's take this and move it up. All right, and I'm actually gonna, let's move it down. I'm gonna keep it after the tone mapping. Now there's some discussion about whether you should use tone mapping first or bloom first. In this case, this was the setup that the artist had used for the scene, so I'm gonna replicate that. And we'll do a session talking about tone mapping, HDR, camera emulation, and so on later on. It's a little more than I wanna get into today. Okay, so we've got our bloom. Now, as you can see, right, it's making quite a difference to our image. If we turn it off, there's the image. Turn it back on. Oh, right. So what we're doing here is we are adding a blurred version of the image that is only blurring the highlights, right? The brightest parts of the image. And so we can control what part of the image is getting blurred using the threshold control here. So we have an intensity control and a threshold. I'll talk about these other settings in a minute. I just want to get the basics down here. So one thing that can be an easy way to see what is happening with an effect like this is we're going to take the intensity, and make it negative, right? Looks weird and ugly unless you're doing something pretty trippy, right? But this is helpful, right? Because we can see very clearly what parts of the image are getting bloomed, right? So the skylight, right, which is the brightest thing in the scene, is getting bloomed. The highlight on the sphere here is getting bloomed. Our light panels are getting bloomed, and this is kind of cool because we can actually see the fluorescent tubes behind the light panels, which I think are part of the emission map of the material. It's pretty neat. The highlights here, this little highlight here, are blooming, right? And so if we adjust the threshold, we can see as we pull it up, less and less things are getting bloomed, right? If we go all the way up, only the brightest things are getting bloomed. In this case, the emissive green material in the background and the skylight, right? So the further you push this value, the brighter things need to be before they start blooming, right? Let's go back to the default, which is around 0.5, and let's take the intensity back up. Now, as we push the intensity, we can see this is how much, basically we're blending in a blurred copy of the image, so how strong is the blurred copy? Right here we can see it's getting very strong. Whoa, to the point of looking totally ridiculous, right? But so basically you can think of this as the amount of blurred highlights that you're adding. I'm going to go a little more subtle here with a sort of a 0.27, 0.25 kind of value. Just something a little gentle, just to add something nice, which I think looks good. Now, the blur iterations here, again, we can think of, going back to our sort of image editing metaphor, this is we're hitting blur once, and then we're blurring again, blurring the resulting image, right? So 1 is the minimum. As we go up, we get a kind of a softer blur, especially looking here at the skylight, right? Let's go up again. That blur is being blurred a third time and a fourth time, right? So really softening it out. I'm going to keep it at 2 because that's sort of doing enough for me. And again, right, we're going to be making a trade-off for performance here, so you want to keep that in mind. The sample distance is the radius of the blur that's being added. So if let's go back to our negative mode for a sec just so we can really see it. As we push the sample distance, we can see this is basically how wide the blur is. And if we go back to our value, we can see it just kind of gets sort of more washed out, or we could go very tight. I think somewhere right in there looks pretty nice. Here's our before, here's our after. And again, right, your mileage may vary. Find something that works for your content. You may have a very dark scene or a very bright scene, and you're going to need to find values that work for you, but these are values that I thought were nice here. The quality here, we can go for a cheaper quality, which is going to be more performant. Let's stick with high quality for now. The complex mode gives us a bunch of additional, a couple of additional options for lens flares. I'm going to let you discover those on your own. I mean, you can make some nice stuff as you turn it up. You see you get these nice like horizontal flares. I'll let you have fun with that. It's not super complex, kind of fun. And yeah, that'll open up some further options, but I'm just going to keep it here in the basic mode for this training. The blend mode here, right? What we're doing is we're blending over a blurred copy of the image. If we switch the blend mode to screen, we see this warning. It's not supported in HDR. Using add instead. So basically nothing happened. Our camera is currently in HDR mode, high dynamic range. The alternative screen mode is basically just another transfer mode for blending in the image. If you want to play around with it, you can. It doesn't look crazy different, but again, for your material, you may find that it interacts with it in a way that you like. In this case, we're just going to use the HDR setting of the camera, which is going to be on. And again, I'll do a lesson where I talk about HDR in more depth later. And so that's basically what I wanted to say about bloom. Let's add in our last effect, which is going to be vignetting. Vignetting is a pretty simple effect. We're going to go to Image Effects, Camera, Vignette, and Chromatic Aberration. Fairly subtle change there, right? Now, I'm going to leave this right where it is. We'll put it above the animator just so it's with the other effects. But we do want this last in the chain. What this is doing, if we turn the vignetting right up, that's all, folks, right? It's the end of a cartoon. Basically, it's just adding this mask, and we can find the mask image in the textures here. Here's the vignette mask image, which you can see is just this sort of white circle on a black background. So it's just rendering this circle over the camera. So it's darkening out the outside border and allowing the center to remain bright. Now, I like this effect. It's camera-like, right? It's trying to emulate some of the effects that you get from a movie camera. But I find that it kind of draws the player's attention nicely into the center of the screen. And again, just gives us a more high contrast image. We can also add some blurring at the corners, which can create some interesting effects, almost like a depth of field-like effect, which is just blurring the stuff in the mask. I'm going to leave it off for now. Again, that's going to be a performance hit, which I don't think we particularly need for this scene. And then we have the chromatic aberration. The chromatic aberration, what it does is it causes a little bit of separation between the color channels. So hence chromatic, right? So as we turn this up, we'll be able to see, especially watch this light up here in the corner. As we push it, you can start to see the color channels separating. Ooh. Whoa, man. You can get some pretty wacky stuff. I find a little bit of this goes a long way. Let's just push it up a touch. I don't really like to see like overt artifacts like that, right? Which is fairly obvious unless you're going for like a hallucination scene, right? And so let's just add just a tiny touch of it. You know, it's just pretty. It's an artifact, right? It's basically a glitch that's added by a camera lens. But from years of watching movies, we tend to like it. And I am one of those people who likes it. So, you know, you may find that you don't, and then you could do without it, but I kind of like the way I like what it adds to a camera. And so let's turn it off. There's our before for the vignetting, and there's our after, right? I'm probably pushing it a little hard here because I want it to be obvious. You could go a little more subtle, but again, right, this is up to you, your game, and finding something that works for you. So now let's play our scene with the effects that we added. And then we'll check it out without them. So this is our after. Ooh, ah. And then I will show you our before version. Let's switch our effects back off. And this is not all of them. I'll put all of them back on in a sec. And here's our before image, right? So obviously not worse, right? It looks nice. It's kind of sharp and crisp. But again, just an aesthetic question, right? I tend to like, especially with hard lines and all this, you know, sort of angular detail, having a little softness in there with the haze and the fog and the bloom, I find is pleasant and goes a long way to kind of making the scene feel a little more, I don't want to say real, but, you know, a little more atmospheric, let's say. And there's with the effects back on. And actually, before I play it, let's turn all of the effects back on. So here's with the anti-aliasing, which I'm going to move down in the chain. You move down. I think that's okay. And then the depth of field and the tone mapping. There we have it. Now you notice the tone mapping is correcting some of those flashes we were getting from the bloom. It's bringing those values down from an HDR into a LDR range and sort of clamping them. So we're not getting some of those flickers that we were getting from some of those hot highlights from the bloom. And bloom and tone mapping definitely sort of go together. I just didn't want to get into the whole HDR, LDR discussion for this session because I felt like we wouldn't get anything else done. But we will do a session where we talk about that later. And there you have it. So let's see, we can do a little Pepsi challenge and see how I did compared to our artist. His looks better. Let's see, he went a lot harder than the chromatic aberration than me. That's why he's an artist and I'm a screencaster. But yeah, so this is the original along with the other effects. And all looking very nice. So that is our show for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm going to hang out in the chat and answer some questions for you guys about image effects. Or if you have any other questions, we can try to get to a couple of those as well. And yeah, thanks very much for watching. So yeah, I see some people discussing artifacts. I mean, this is a funny thing, right? I was having the same discussion with the artist who made this about how, you know, people, cinematographers and stuff, spend a lot of time and money trying to get rid of a lot of this stuff, a lot of these artifacts, a lot of the kind of camera artifacts and glitches. And of course, you know, we in games are like, no, we want it to look camera-like. Let's add back in all the glitches and artifacts, right? Which is kind of funny. But, you know, it's like the discussion about some people like vinyl, you know, analog sound more than digital. They just like the artifacts better. You know, so it's really just a question of choosing what artifacts you like and what aesthetic you're going for, right? And this should always be creatively motivated by the vision of your game. Yeah, and those asking whether these are 2D or 3D, these are pixel-based, right? So the frame, you know, there are some things that use some of the depth buffer, like the screen space ambient occlusion, right? That is actually using some Z-axis data, but things like bloom, vignette, well, the fog actually uses Z-axis data too, so that is using some 3D, but the many of them are just operating on the frame buffer, right, on the pixels that are being output from the renderer and then adding their effect to them, so will be usable in 2D or 3D games. Thanks, Pyroman. Yes, I can show the depth buffer. Let's see if I know how to do it. In the depth of field, yes. Let's take a look. There's a way to do this. See, I'll visualize. Here we go. Yeah. So this is showing us, here we can see, this is to show the focal distance of the of this particular effect, right? But we can see sort of what, we can see the depth buffer there a little bit, or this is just like a visualization of it, but yeah. This is the data that the stuff like the fog, the depth of field, anything that's using the Z-axis to add additional. It's basically using the Z-axis data to render different parts of the image differently, right? So if this is, you know, this color, it's going to render it one way, and then something deeper in, it's going to be rendered another. I'm not totally sure how the SSAO works to figure out where the little cracks are, but it does. That's why I don't write shaders. Yes, SNYM07, SNYM07. You can make your own custom image effects. You need to learn about writing shaders. Shadows of the excuse me, Shadows of the Beast wants to know how to do a monochrome effect. Use the color correction image effect, the curves one maybe, and pull the saturation to 0. You'll get black and white. Red vignette effect when you get hit. You know what I would do? I would just make in the UI system, make a mask that is like that vignette image, but red, and just fade up the opacity when you're hit for a couple of frames and fade it back down. If you look at the Survival Shooters project, there's an effect like that without the vignetting, but just with it just flashes the screen red when you get hit, and there's some code in there that you could just grab that'll totally work. Oboe shape. I don't think that the fog is volumetric. I think it's not like responding to the emission. There is like a sun shafts script, I think, that tries to do volumetric fog, but if I remember, it's got some issues. It's like not very performant, maybe. Omatase, I think that I don't know if there is a good and easy way to do volumetric lighting. I know there's some stuff on the asset store. I think the challenge you're always going to have there is performance. Michael TKA Chuck, Michael Tikachuk. Sorry if I messed up your name there. Yes, the effects are fairly computationally intensive, right? So now one of the things is if you reduce certain settings in there, like for example on the vignetting, if you take the vignetting down, if you take the blurred corners to 0, by setting that value to 0, it's not actually doing a blur pass, right? So it'll get a little more computationally friendly, right? So you want to choose which of these you really need for your game. You know, throwing everything at it is not always the best solution, right? And so you want to find a nice balance. I mean, I have a personal project of mine, or simplify your geometry or simplify the scene that you're rendering, right? Use less materials. I have a personal project where, you know, I'm running bloom, vignette, fog, color correction, a couple other things, and I get up to like 90, 100 frames per second on this same computer that I was just chugging away on. So it's definitely possible to get high performance with image effects, but you're just going to be balancing your scene complexity versus your image effects. I mean, this is a lighting demo, so it's, you know, they're kind of pushing it a little bit. This would be something more aimed towards your kind of AAA high-end console gaming PC kind of market, as opposed to the iMac that I'm running it on here. FS Tabor, thanks. Glad you enjoyed the stream. Awesome. Glad to hear it. He says, I believe we're using everything you covered in Shroud of the Avatar and many others we've written. Excellent. Yeah, and that's a really good point. You know, you can write these yourself. You know, I mean, you got to know a little bit about graphics programming, but that stuff can be learned. And, you know, that is definitely a way to get a lot of people in the past have kind of said, oh, you know, all things from this engine or that engine look the same. A lot of the time that's the shaders, right? If you're using the default shaders that come with an engine, you're going to have something that looks a lot like everybody else. Whereas if you dig in a little bit and learn to do a little bit more on the graphics programming side, you can kind of get your own unique look. So it's definitely worth investing time and attention to. Maybe Studio asks, most image effects can't be used with a mobile platform, right? I would say it's not that they can't be used, but as with any of this stuff, it's all about optimization, right? So if you wanted to use a lot of image effects, you would probably need to simplify, for example, the amount of geometry in your scene or the number of textures you were using, or you know, find a way to balance that performance. You could give up a few milliseconds a frame to the image effects and take it away from something else, you know? So if you're like, I've got to have this fog in my mobile game, well, then maybe you can find a way to take it out of your performance budget somewhere else. So definitely possible to use image effects on mobile, especially, you know, the more high-end mobile devices. But it's a balancing act. Omatase is asking, is there a way to test the performance that would be experienced by someone with a slow computer, even if I develop it on a fast computer? That's a tough one. I would say get a slow computer. There are some, which should be cheap, right? Because it's slow. There are some, you can change the graphics emulation mode, which I admit I don't know how to do actually, but you can like disable it so you're not using certain graphics features and stuff, but that won't actually like emulate bad performance. So there's not an easy way to do that. Bloodbath is asking, I'm a bit confused with Unity 5. Excuse me. I can't find the Skybox package. The Skybox is actually a procedural material. If you look, where is it? If you search for, or actually if you go to create new material Skybox, you can create a new one. So it's going to be create material and then set the type, the shader, to Skybox procedural. That's the Unity, the default Skybox, the 5 Skybox, and then you can play with the sky tint and the ground and play with it, make the sky and make the sun really big. Ah. The procedural Skybox, it just means that it's this material type here that you can tweak. It's not a bitmap. It's not an image. It's a shader. And so you can change the sun size, you can change the atmosphere thickness, make it look all crazy. Oh, look at that. Change the sky tint, change the exposure. Look, you can make it dark. Anybody who's got, more detailed questions that we can't get to on the Q&A, just please post on the forums. We've got a live training thread on the forum. You can post there or in an appropriate sub forum. Adam is a little more active on there than I am, but I'm on there too. I think there's some awesome, To Infinity and Beyond asks, what do you think of the recent Unity games which have released? The Forest, Son of Nor, and Stranded Deep. I sadly have not played any of those, but I can say that there's some amazing looking stuff coming out between City Skylines, Ori and the Blind Forest, which I'm really looking forward to playing. Just looks beautiful. Are both Unity, and I think Pillars of Eternity that just came out is also Unity. I was just looking, and I think like 3 or 4 of the top Metacritic score games right now are all Unity titles, so that's pretty cool. All right, guys. Well, I think we'll wind it down. Thanks very much to all the new people who tuned in, all the regulars. Great to see you again. We will be back next week with another session. And yeah, thanks again for logging in.